Hello and welcome to Slow Sleep Stories. Today's tale is called The Middle Schooler Who Accidentally Solved a Town Puzzle. It follows an 11-year-old named Milo Jensen, whose love for puzzles, peanut butter sandwiches, and quiet walks ends up unraveling a decades-old mystery in his sleepy hometown of Stillwater, Pennsylvania. Thanks. Before you get comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Now, turn off the lights, get comfortable, and let's start this journey together tonight. Stillwater, Pennsylvania wasn't the kind of place where much happened. There were more porch swings than people under 30, and the loudest thing most days was the clunk of the postman's boots on the old courthouse steps. It was the kind of town where summer seemed to pause longer than anywhere else, where you could smell biscuits baking 2 blocks away, and where a slight breeze could be mistaken for gossip. In this town, tucked between the hills and the antique barns, lived a boy named Milo Jensen. Milo had a face full of freckles, hair that seemed to be trying to outrun combs, and a mind that wandered faster than most grown-ups could follow. He wasn't particularly loud or athletic, though he could balance a spoon on his nose longer than any kid in his class. His hobbies included counting the ceiling tiles in homeroom, drawing tiny maps in the margins of his math homework, and making sandwiches with exactly 1.5 tablespoons of peanut butter anymore, and it felt excessive, every afternoon. After school, while most kids were arguing over which video game was better, or trading snacks in the parking lot, Milo walked the long way home. He said it helped him stretch his brain. Fell asleep on a fishing pole. Stillwater was proud of its history, mostly because it was easier than making new history. Old buildings stood like retired actors. Office that had 3 jars of buttons and a sock. From 1890, you had to ring the bell twice to get the key, but Milo didn't care much for dusty exhibits. What fascinated him were the odd things no one talked about anymore, or the tiny door under the bridge, which didn't seem to lead anywhere but always smelled faintly of cinnamon. And most of all, he was fascinated by the sidewalk behind the library. It was cracked in just the right spots to jump over without missing a beat. And if you looked closely, you'd see what Milo saw: initials. Not the kind kids carve with pocket knives during recess. These were etched with perfect spacing, neat loops, and a pattern so strange it made his peanut butter sandwiches taste like questions. One square read BJ equals L, while another simply had R6 carved neatly in the corner. A few bore compass directions, others just symbols like stars or keys. Milo once asked his teacher, Ms. Freeman, if she knew about the sidewalk engravings. She smiled in the way adults do when they don't want to admit they don't know something. Oh, that's just old stuff. No one really remembers. That answer, of course, only made it worse, or better, depending on how curious you are. And Milo, well, his brain was like a drawer that always opened when something mysterious walked by. One chilly Tuesday in October, while he waited for his sandwich to unsquish itself in his backpack, Milo knelt beside the largest engraving 4 letters, arranged like compass points, SKLE. Underneath, faint but real, was a tiny arrow pointing toward the library's basement windows. Milo tilted his head. Then, because no one was watching, he whispered, "I bet you mean something." The wind picked up slightly, almost in response, and a single red leaf drifted down and landed on the K. Or maybe not. Stillwater wasn't used to puzzles, at least not the kind that didn't come with instruction manuals or crossword clues. The town's last great mystery had been whether Mrs. Kramer's cat was sneaking into the bakery at night. It was, but Milo had a feeling this was something else, something older, and just never finished. His heart beat in a funny rhythm the rest of the way home, like it knew something his brain was still catching up to. That night, instead of watching cartoons or pretending to do spelling homework, Milo found himself tracing letters in the fog on his bedroom window. S-K-L-E. He didn't know what it meant yet, but he would. He could feel it. Like how you can tell a puzzle piece is about to click into place. Outside, Stillwater glowed under sleepy street lamps. The town hummed the same tune it always had, gentle, slow, content. But inside one quiet house, on Birchwood Lane, a middle schooler had just found the beginning of something unexpected, something that had waited patiently beneath everyone's feet. The next afternoon, Milo skipped his usual detour past the bakery. His peanut butter sandwich was tucked carefully in his bag this time, with a note to himself that read, "Don't squish." He made a beeline to the library, weaving through shadows of elm trees and dodging a rake full of leaves like it was a booby trap. When he arrived, he dropped to one knee, the way a knight might before a royal puzzle. The engraving was still there, S-K-L-E, and just beneath it, the faint arrow pointing toward the basement. This time, Milo brought tools: a spiral notebook, a stubby pencil he found in the school, lost and found, and a flashlight with batteries just strong enough to pretend they worked. As he sat on the cold sidewalk, he noticed the letters weren't carved like vandalism. They were even methodical, like someone had taken real care in making them. Milo carefully copied the letters and arrow into his notebook, labeling them Clue 1. Then he stood, brushed the grass from his jeans, and peered around the library's brick wall. Looked ordinary enough: dusty windows, a clump of ivy, and a faded poster for last year's book sale. But the arrow, it pointed down, and down was the window to the basement. Milo leaned over, pressing his nose to the glass. All he saw was a stack of broken chairs, a dusty piano, and a box labeled Winter Mittens. Still, his heart did a small leap. Someone had gone through the trouble of leaving a trail. That meant there had to be more. Milo circled the block 3 times that afternoon, checking every section of sidewalk like a squirrel guarding a secret stash of acorns. On his second loop, he found it, a small carving near the corner of Maple and 3rd, BJ equals L. It looked older than the other one, like time had tried to erase it, but gave up halfway. He copied that one too. Then another, R6, carved right beside the crooked fire hydrant outside Stillwater Deli. Milo had passed it hundreds of times, never noticing anything except the smell of pickles. By the end of the week, his notebook was filling up. 14 engravings, some with letters, some with shapes. One was just a pair of tiny wings near the back entrance of the bowling alley. He circled that one twice, just to be sure it wasn't a squished moth. At home, he laid the clues out across his floor, replacing his toy train set with puzzle pieces and index cards. His parents thought he was studying geography. His sister assumed it was a very unfun version of charades. Neither paid much attention. Milo didn't mind. Secrets liked silence, but puzzles, they needed order. He tried everything: alphabetical, numerical, even astrological. He squinted at the letters sideways, held them up to the light, even sniffed one just in case. He began calling the sidewalk the board, and his notebook became the guide. He gave himself a code name, the Looker. One rainy Saturday, he stopped by the library and asked Ms. Ellen, the librarian, if she knew anything about sidewalk carvings. She paused, her fingers hovering over a stack of returned books. "Oh," she said, adjusting her glasses, "that old sidewalk. I remember kids used to mess around back there when I was in grade school. One summer, they called themselves the Sidewalk Society. thought they were detectives. Did they solve anything? Milo asked. Only their own boredom, I think, she said, smiling softly. As Milo turned to leave, she added, funny, they remember someone once said those markings were part of a game. But if there were rules, they got lost a long time ago. Game. The word slid into Milo's mind like the missing piece of a jigsaw puzzle. A game had rules, goals, patterns. Milo didn't just have clues, he had moves. That night, he couldn't sleep. Every time he shut his eyes, he saw letters floating in the dark, dancing in unfamiliar combinations. His lamp clicked on 3 times between midnight and 2 a.m. at one point. He even tried meditating like his aunt from Colorado suggested. That mostly resulted in him thinking about lasagna. Still, something was happening. He could feel it in the way his feet automatically took him to new corners of the town, in the way his fingers traced invisible lines between hydrants, signs, and mailboxes. The puzzle wasn't random. It was scattered, maybe, and worn down by time, but it wasn't nonsense, even if no one else had seen it for 50 years. Milo had, and that made it real again. The next morning, as mist curled over the Stillwater rooftops and the bakery began its ritual of warming up cinnamon rolls at precisely 6:03 a.m., Milo stood on the corner of Elm and Pickett Street, staring down at a familiar pattern, D13, 3 bricks to the right, a shape that looked like a kite. The clues weren't just part of the sidewalk. They were the sidewalk. It rained for 3 days straight in Stillwater. Not the dramatic lightning and flash flood kind of rain, but the slow, steady drizzle that seemed determined to turn sidewalks into soup and make hair frizz with purpose. Most kids spent the time indoors, lounging with cartoons or arguing with siblings over the last cherry fruit snack. But Milo spent the rainiest afternoon of the week crawling near the storm drain at the edge of Parker Avenue, knees soaked, hair plastered to his forehead, and a piece of chalk clenched in one muddy hand like it was a relic of ancient treasure hunters. This particular storm drain had always bothered him, not because it was creepy though, it did make strange gurgling sounds at night, but because it had something carved into the lip of its frame, barely visible. Unless you were kneeling directly in the puddle like he was now, a triangle, not a very exciting shape. Unless you noticed what Milo did, the triangle had a second, smaller triangle nestled inside it, with a tiny dot in the center. It reminded him of the play button on a remote, or a compass that had forgotten which way was north. He jotted the symbol into his notebook, now proudly labeled Stillwater Enigma, Volume 1, and circled it 3 times. Then he leaned in and whispered, "Gotcha." The puddle responded with a plop, probably just a frog, or maybe the drain answering back. Back home, Milo spread his clues out again, tracing string between them like he'd seen in detective movies. D13, SKLE, the wings, the triangle. It was starting to feel like a map, only the destination hadn't declared itself yet. That night, after eating soup he didn't remember ordering and declining to explain the mud on his shoes, Milo sat by his window with a flashlight and a slice of cheese. It was thinking food, and while chewing slowly, he remembered something. Back in 1st grade, his teacher had given him a worksheet about patterns. He had stared at the problem. Red square, blue circle, red square. At the time he guessed randomly, but now it made sense. Repetition, outliers, the odd thing that didn't fit. Milo turned to his notebook. Most of the carvings were letters, some had numbers, but 5, exactly 5, were shapes: the triangle, the wings, the kite, the key, and one circle with a slash he had found near the train depot. 5 shapes, 5 letters in SKLE. That ... didn't match ... except ... It did, sort of. He flipped back a few pages, reread each note, then spread his arms wide like a conductor trying to coax a sleepy orchestra into harmony. If the letters were coordinates, like locations, and the shapes were actions like turning or stepping, then the sidewalk wasn't just marked randomly. It was telling a story. His heart thudded. The rain had paused. The clouds, perhaps sensing something afoot, began to part ever so slightly, and Milo, unable to wait a second longer, grabbed his coat and snuck out the side door. He raced toward the train depot. The station was barely used anymore, just a weekend stop for tourists headed to the country fairs. But the lot behind it was lined with stone path sand. One of those stones had the slashed circle etched into its corner. Milo knelt and ran his fingers over the symbol again. Then he looked up, slowly turning his head. The train sign, battered and faded, pointed toward the edge of Stillwater's nature trail, the one people only used in the spring. And below the sign, a small arrow carved into the wood. Another one, not paint, not stickers, carved, just like all the rest. He followed the arrow. The trail wound like a sleepy snake through the woods. The trees here stood like old librarians, tall, quiet, and vaguely irritated if you spoke too loudly. The path, usually overgrown, had been cleared recently. That was odd. Milo stepped lightly, watching for signs. A stick snapped underfoot, and he froze, heart thumping like a bass drum. But nothing happened. No squirrels scolded him. No owls blinked. The woods were as still as the stories his grandpa told before bed, slow, warm, and hiding just enough detail to keep your eyes wide. 10 minutes in, he spotted it. A small stone post half buried in moss, and on its surface, SKLE. It wasn't the sidewalk carving it, was cleaner, deeper, preserved. And this time the letters sat around a sun symbol, rays pointing outward like a compass. Milo crouched, breath fogging, his fingers trembled. As he touched the stone, he had found the source. It wasn't just a kid's game or sidewalk graffiti. Someone had built this, designed it for others to find. A trail of clues across the whole town, leading to this forgotten marker in the woods. And all of it had waited for years. For someone with time, with questions, with curiosity. Someone like him. He sat there for a moment longer, letting the silence wrap around him like a blanket. Then, softly, as if sharing a secret with the trees, he whispered, "I think I found your finish line." But the wind rustled, and a leaf tumbled by, brushing the stone. And that's when Milo realized this wasn't the finish, it was the beginning. The next morning, Milo woke up earlier than usual, before the sun had even decided whether it was going to show up properly. He tossed off his blanket, still in yesterday's jeans, and dashed for his notebook. Every corner of his brain felt like it had been gently wiggled awake overnight. That stone marker hadn't just been a stop along the way. It was ... central, a hub, a clue to the entire puzzle's shape. By 7:15 a.m., Milo had snuck 2 granola bars and a packet of cheddar crackers into his backpack. He left a note on the fridge that read, "Library, studying," which wasn't entirely false, just ... geographically misleading. Back at the nature trail, Deuce licked the grass and turned every spiderweb into a beaded necklace of morning light. Milo retraced his steps carefully, boots crunching softly on the gravel as the town behind him disappeared in mist and drowsy bird calls. When he reached the stone post again, he took out his flashlight and gently swept it over the ground around the marker. This time, something caught his eye: 2 sticks, laid side by side beneath a small pile of leaves. not a natural fall. Intentional. He brushed them away beneath the sticks. A patch of earth looked unusually loose, as though someone had disturbed it and then half-heartedly covered it back up. Milo knelt, scooped the dirt away with both hands, and uncovered the base of an old tree, one of those thick, gnarled trunks that looked like it had been around since dinosaurs debated tea versus coffee. There was a hollow, and inside the hollow, a leather-bound book, dusty, slightly damp on the bottom corner, and fastened with a brass clasp shaped like Milo squinted a sideways compass. His fingers shook as he opened it. Inside the front cover was a name, Sarah K. Lemberg, followed by a date, 1976. Below that, a single phrase, written in flowing script, "If you've found this, the game still lives." Milo let out a soft, unintentional laugh, more a breath than a sound. The same letters, S-K-L-E. This wasn't a mystery someone forgot to solve. It was a mystery waiting to be continued. He turned the pages. The journal wasn't long. 20 or so entries. Some were written in code, others in doodles maps of the town. With odd marks in corners, Milo now recognized the storm drain, the library steps, the train depot, and even the bakery. But what caught his attention most was a list near the middle, titled, "Members of the Sidewalk Society, Summer of '76, 10 names, most scribbled in pen, one name Ceres circled." At the bottom, in much younger handwriting, a sentence read, "If we forget the story forgets us." It hit Milo like a drop of rain landing right between his eyes. This wasn't just a puzzle. It was a memory someone didn't want to lose, a way of keeping childhood alive, a record of a summer that meant something. As he sat cross-legged in the moss, flipping pages and letting the morning light curl around his shoulders like a cardigan, Milo felt something settle in his chest, like he'd been invited into a story that still had room for another character. And then, tucked into the very back of the book, was a folded piece of paper. He opened it carefully. It was a map not of the town, but of the trail itself, and at the end of the trail, marked with an X, was something labeled simply, "The Vault." No other instructions, no warnings, just an arrow pointing deeper into the woods. Milo glanced around. The birds were still chirping lazily. A squirrel watched him from a branch with something like approval. Maybe he packed the journal carefully into his backpack and stood up. The trail ahead bent slightly to the right and disappeared into thicker trees. As he stepped onto the path, he whispered, "Vault, here I come." The trail narrowed. The trees leaned in a little closer, as if curious to hear the footsteps of a boy on an adventure. Milo's boots brushed through ferns and kicked up the scent of damp leaves and something earthy, moss maybe, or maybe secrets. He passed a small stone shaped like a heart, then another with a cracked circle carved on the top. The clues had shifted from obvious to subtle. He walked for 20 minutes before he saw it, a boulder, taller than him, with vines trailing down one side like a lazy beard, and on the base of the rock, a metal latch. Milo froze. He walked slowly around the boulder, fingers brushing the surface. The metal latch was attached to a wooden panel, weathered but intact. He gave it a small tug. It creaked open. Inside, a narrow staircase descended into the ground. Not steep, not dramatic, just ... unexpected and thrilling. There was no question about what he would do next. He pulled out his flashlight, adjusted his backpack, and whispered, mostly to himself, "If I disappear, make sure they name a sandwich after me." Then he smiled, stepped onto the first stair, and descended. The darkness welcomed him like an old friend. The staircase dipped slowly into cool, damp air. the kind that made your ears feel like they'd suddenly been wrapped in fog. Milo's flashlight cut a soft beam ahead, revealing walls lined with all things painted bricks, yellow, blue, red, then yellow again. Not random, patterned, like the tiles of an old-school hallway that had been quietly hiding underground all these years. There was a smell to not unpleasant, just dusty, like paperbacks and chalk, and that corner of the library where no one but old janitors ever seemed to walk. Milo reached the bottom after 12 gentle steps. The flashlight swept across what looked like a small room, no bigger than a walk-in closet, with wooden slats forming a ceiling and 2 narrow benches lining the walls. At first, it seemed empty. Then he turned to the far corner and saw it. A box, simple, wooden, the size of a microwave, and carved on the front was that triangle symbol again, this time with the tiny dot glowing faintly. Milo blinked. Was it glowing, or was that just the flashlight bouncing oddly? Either way, it called to him like a book that hadn't been opened in 100 years. He knelt beside it. No lock, just a latch, smooth from use, and a little brass handle that squeaked slightly when he lifted it. The lid groaned open. Inside, stacked neatly, were notebooks, at least 30 of them. Different colors, different handwritings, some bound with string, others with little metal rings. On the inside covers of each, a name, a date, and a small sentence. Some had jokes, "Don't tell my older sister I was in this club," others poetic lines, "The sidewalks taught me to listen." One simply said, "Stillwater never really forgets." Each notebook belonged to someone, some from the 70s, others from the early 2000s. There was even one dated just 5 years ago, written in purple gel pen with cartoon clouds doodled in the margins. Milo's heart raced. The Sidewalk Society had lived for decades, quietly, peacefully, without fanfare. People had added their stories and left them here buried in a vault beneath the park, beneath the town, like treasure you couldn't spend but could never lose. He flipped through one of the older journals and found a sketched map of Stillwater, annotated with coffee stains and mystery. It pointed out a spot behind the hardware store with the phrase, "Ask for the birdseed discount." Milo made a note of it in his own notebook, along with another that simply read, "The triangle listens." He didn't know what it meant yet, but he would. He carefully set the journals back the way he'd found them, and in the one empty space left in the box, he tucked in Sarah K. Lemberg's journal. A small note on the back of her final page read, "Pass it on." He smiled, softly. Done. He stepped back, closed the lid, and sat on the bench for a long, quiet minute. A drop of water plunked somewhere in the darkness. Dust settled. The room didn't feel haunted. It felt held, like a secret kept not for selfishness, but for kindness, for wonder. He took out his granola bar and ate half, left the other half sitting neatly on the bench, just in case someone came down later with an appetite and appreciation for oats. Then he climbed the stairs again, back in the forest. The afternoon light had taken on a golden warmth, filtered through the trees in such a way that it felt like stepping into a painting. Milo looked back toward the trail and whispered, "I'll be back." Not a promise, a certainty. As he walked toward town, everything looked a little different. The lampposts seemed to nod at him. The curbs seemed to have more to say. Every crack in the sidewalk, every scuff on a bench, every scribble on a wall held potential. Stillwater had never been quiet. He'd just never listened properly. At the edge of the nature trail, a small, wooden sign greeted him. He was sure it hadn't been there before. It read, "Leave it better than you found it." Classic old person wisdom, but it felt right back in town. Milo ducked into the library. Mrs. Cartwright, the librarian, gave him a slow smile as he passed. "Learn anything new today?" she asked, peering over her half-moon glasses. Milo shrugged. "Just some old stories." She winked. "Those are the best kind." Upstairs in the reading loft, he sat cross-legged again, journal open, and began sketching everything name, the box, the birdseed note, the triangle with the dot. But this time, at the top of the page, he wrote, "Stillwater Sidewalk Society, 2025, because now it was his, and maybe, just maybe, someone else would find it one day too, and they'd smile and kneel by a storm drain and whisper gotcha." Milo had barely finished his second sketch when a shadow fell across the library loft. He looked up, and there she was, Clara J. Fenster, same polka-dot hoodie, same mild scowl of concentration she wore in science class whenever someone asked if Saturn was the sun's cousin. Clara was known for exactly 3 things in Stillwater Middle School: being the fastest typist in homeroom, having a nearly encyclopedic knowledge of mushrooms, and never not once being surprised by anything, until now. "You've been crawling in the drainage pipe again," she said calmly, arms folded, eyebrow arched. Milo blinked. "What?" Clara pointed to the back of his jeans. Mud stains, a perfect, soggy crescent where he'd knelt by the storm drain. "Also," she continued, "you're writing in your notebook like it's the next chapter of a secret society handbook, and you just tried to hide it when I walked up." Milo caught red-handed door, rather ink-handed side, then offered a spot on the carpet. Clara sat down cross-legged without a word. He looked around to make sure Mrs. Cartwright wasn't watching and flipped open the map he'd redrawn from Sarah's journal. Then, without any ceremony, he said, "There's a secret society underneath the town. I found their vault in the woods, and I think I've accidentally become a member." Clara stared. Milo braced for laughter, or the word weirdo, or even a gentle request that he'd never talk to her again. But instead, she adjusted her glasses, leaned forward, and asked, "Was it triangle-based?" "What?" Clara pulled out her own notebook, a small, yellow one she usually carried for mushroom sketches, and opened it to a page titled "Odd Things in Stillwater." On it, a list: triangle chalk marks near the train depot, fire hydrant on Elm Street that hums every 3rd Thursday, old man Felix, who mutters the vault, listens during bingo, mysterious library book that disappeared after being checked out by S. In 1976, Milo gawked. "You've been tracking things too, of course," Clara said, clearly annoyed he hadn't assumed as much. "Stillwater is too quiet. I don't trust quiet." Together, they formed a plan. Over the next few days, they scouted more locations from the journals. Behind the bakery, nothing. At the base of the water tower, just raccoon tracks. But at the far edge of the community garden, near a decaying picket fence, they found a metal ring embedded in the ground. Pulling it revealed an old milk crate filled with small folded slips of paper. Each one bore a riddle. Some were silly. "What sits by day but walks by night?" Others poetic. "I am cracked but hold the town together." None had signatures. They weren't answers. They were invitations, breadcrumbs left by past members. Clara sat cross-legged in the dirt, flipping through the notes. "This is amazing. Someone didn't just make a club, they made a whole language." Milo smiled. "I think we're supposed to learn how to speak it." Over the next week, they added to the crate their own clues, their own jokes. One slip said, "Don't trust the duck near the post office." There wasn't a duck yet. Another said, "Sidewalk crack, whisper back." Clara even slipped in a mushroom drawing with a tiny triangle in its cap. They waited 3 days, then 4. On the 5th day, they found a new note. "We hear you. Welcome." Milo could hardly breathe. He looked at Clara, who only said, "Told you. Triangle people are organized." Then came the knock, not at Milo's door, but at his email inbox. A message from an unlisted address, with the subject line, "Sidewalk. Society, Business." He opened it. It contained only one sentence: "The bell in the clock tower hasn't rung since '99, wanna fix it." There was an attachment, a map, a time. Saturday, noon. They looked at each other. Excitement bloomed in Milo's chest, like a warm, fizzy soda he wasn't supposed to drink past 9 p.m. They met at the library steps that Saturday, both pretending they just happened to be there. Clara wore hiking boots. Milo had packed 2 sandwiches. The map led them not into the tower. Stillwater had no working elevator but behind it, through a narrow alley lined with ivy. At the end, a service door, already unlocked. Inside, an old spiral staircase. Dust floated in the light, like memories that had nowhere better to go. At the top, they found a chamber filled with ropes, pulleys, and, most surprising of all, a fresh note taped to the bell's base. It read, "Traditions fade. We remembered this one for you." Next to the note, a long cord. Clara, without ceremony, pulled it. The bell rang. For the first time in over 20 years, Stillwater heard its own heart beating again, a slow, clear sound that drifted out over trees, homes, and sidewalks. Milo and Clara sat on the floor and listened. The tower creaked. Dust settled. Somewhere below, someone must have looked up and smiled, unsure why. That was the thing about Stillwater's puzzle. It didn't need to be solved. It just wanted to be shared. Stillwater Elementary had one of the strangest playgrounds in the county. It wasn't the equipment. It had the usual monkey bars, seesaws, and that suspiciously fast merry-go-round that every parent quietly hated. No, it was the slide, the long, twisting silver one that snaked from a small platform down into a bed of mulch. It hummed, only sometimes, only if you put your ear to the metal on a particularly quiet day. Milo had never noticed it until a Thursday afternoon, when Claire ate a peanut butter and pickle sandwich. "Don't ask," casually mentioned the old slide. "It hums if the wind's right, or maybe if you ask it nicely." That was all it took. That night, after homework, Milo found himself wandering back toward the school. He didn't even need to sneak in. Stillwater was the kind of place where fences weren't taken too seriously, and playgrounds became dreamscapes after dusk. The moon was up, soft and round like a whispered secret, and the slide shimmered in its light. He put his ear to the cool metal. Nothing then. Just as he was about to pull away, it came, a whisper, not a voice, more like a tone, a soft, rhythmic vibration that pulsed through the metal, like a heartbeat, if hearts were made of tuning forks and poetry. He pressed his ear again. The hum grew clearer. Patterns, a loop, a message. Milo sat cross-legged at the base of the slide and listened for 10 whole minutes. The sound didn't change, didn't grow louder or softer, simply was. Back at the library the next day, he and Clara tried recording the sound with Milo's phone. It didn't work. But when they ran the audio through a spectrogram, something Clara had learned about from a true crime podcast, it revealed a simple image, a triangle, with a ... again. Milo stared. "How is that even possible?" Clara grinned. "We're either losing our minds or being invited to a party." The next day, they returned to the vault in the woods. Milo felt more comfortable now, moving through the overgrown path like it had always belonged to him. The stairs creaked like old friends greeting him. Inside, The wooden box had changed. A new notebook sat neatly on top. This one was red dot, and on its cover, Milo J. and Clara J. Stillwater observers. Inside, a note written in crisp, careful cursive. You've listened well. You've added new sounds to our town. Keep going. The puzzle never ends, it only expands. Beneath the note was a page for them to sign. Clara went first, writing in tiny, tidy letters. Milo followed, a bit shaky. They left their own addition too, a fresh riddle. What do sidewalks say when no one's walking? Whatever they want. The next few weeks blurred together. Not in a rush, but in a gentle kind of unfolding. Like the way bread dough slowly rises if you leave it near the radiator. Milo and Clara explored other clues left in the town, one in the form of a musical tune played by the ice cream truck. A slightly off-key version of She Be Coming Round the Mountain that matched a hum Clara discovered coming from an old pipe near the cemetery gate. Another clue came when Milo noticed how every third streetlight on Maple Avenue flickered a little to rhythmically Morse code. Clara guessed it spelled out the word linger. They did. In Stillwater, everything meant something. You just had to know how to listen. Milo's mom started asking why he'd been so cheerful lately. He shrugged. Just school stuff, which was technically true. He was sleeping better, too. Like the mysteries had somehow settled his mind. Every night, he scribbled in his journal, not just puzzles and symbols now, but feelings, thoughts, memories of small things, a neighbor's laugh, the shape of clouds that morning, how the smell of pencil shavings reminded him of September. Stillwater had gotten louder in the quietest, most beautiful way, and all of it, the vault, the notebooks, the clues, the triangle, was now part of him. On a cool Friday evening, as the sun dipped below the treetops and turned the sky that deep sherbet orange, Milo and Clara sat on the top step of the bell tower, legs swinging freely. They didn't talk for a while. Then Clara said, "What if there's more like this in other towns?" Milo nodded. "Probably, maybe everywhere." She grinned. "Guess we'll need more notebooks." They clinked juice boxes. And far below, on the sidewalk in front of the post office, someone had drawn a triangle in chalk. Not them. Someone new. The story, it seemed, was catching on. The school year was winding down, the days growing warmer and longer. Milo and Clara spent their afternoons tracing the faint chalk lines that now appeared around town, each one a gentle nudge to keep exploring. Their secret puzzle society had quietly woven itself into the fabric of Stillwater, like soft threads in an old quilt, comforting and unassuming. One Saturday morning, the pair found themselves sitting beneath the sprawling oak tree at the edge of the community garden there. Unofficial headquarters. Milo flipped through the latest notebook, the pages filled with riddles, sketches, and hopeful notes from other kids who had stumbled onto their little world. "It's funny," Milo murmured, tracing a doodle of the triangle symbol, "how something so small can make everything feel so big." Clara nodded slowly, her gaze drifting to the garden beds where new plants were sprouting. "It's like we built a bridge between stories and reality, a place where the ordinary becomes a secret adventure." They shared a quiet smile, the kind that only years of whispered mysteries and shared discoveries could create. As the sun dipped lower, casting a warm, amber glow, Milo realized how much the puzzle had changed him. He was no longer just the kid who loved drawing in the margins of his notebook. He was part of a living story, a story that stretched beyond the edges of maps and notes. That evening, Milo wrote one last note in the red notebook. "To whoever finds this next, keep listening to the quiet. Keep finding the stories that hide beneath the everyday." And remember, the puzzle is always waiting. M&C, he closed the notebook gently, the weight of it comforting in his hands. As he turned to leave the garden, a soft breeze stirred the leaves, carrying with it the faintest hum from the old slide, a whispered farewell from Stillwater itself. Milo smiled to himself. This was not an ending, it was the soft, slow beginning of many stories yet to come, and with that he felt ready for whatever quiet adventures tomorrow might bring. Good night.